So our last group of bacteria. So we had a whole chapter on gram-positive bacteria, a whole chapter on gram-negative bacteria. This last chapter, they are all gram-negative bacteria, but they're all unique. So they look different, they behave different, they've got unique structures to them. Maybe it's the size, maybe it's their cell wall. They're all a little different. So there are unusual bacteria. Sometimes the microbiology textbooks will literally just call them unusual bacteria. There's 4 groups of unusual bacteria. Again, they are all gram-negative. They're just unusual. So our 4 groups that we're going to talk about today are the rickettsias, the chlamydias, the spirochetes, and the vibrios. Here we go. So our 4 groups. The rickettsia group, we're going to talk about 3 different bacteria. The chlamydias, we'll talk primarily about the one chlamydia you normally think of when you hear that genus, but there's other bacteria in the chlamydia group. We'll talk about some of the spirochetes, one of the 2. If you're like, actually I'm like, if you've never heard of Treponema or Borrelia, you will for sure have heard of the 2 diseases they've caused. And then we'll talk about 3 vibrio bacteria. So the first group, the rickettsia group, again, we'll talk about 3 bacteria, but the group itself, why they're in their own separate little unusual bacteria group, is partly based on their size. They're extremely small. I mean, bacteria are small, but these are like the smallest of the bacteria, to the point for a while I'm like, we didn't even know they existed, because they're getting down into that almost big virus size. They appear wall-less. So if we gram stain them, they are gram-negative, as everything in here, but they have very little peptidoglycan. I mean, gram-negative already have a very thin cell wall. These have an even thinner cell wall, but they still have 2 membranes. They're still gram-negative. It's just like the thinnest of the thinnest cell wall. And the bacteria in this group are obligate intracellular parasites. Obligate means it's required that they live inside of their host cell, like a virus does. And while they live there, they're parasitic, which means they cause damage to the host cell. So this is an actual picture of a human cell with bacteria, gram-negative, and I'm like living inside of them, causing damage and destruction, which is why they then cause diseases. So 3 genus in our rickettsia group. Only one of the bacteria genus actually gets the name rickettsia for our rickettsia group, and it's Rickettsia rickettsii. Now, the disease that rickettsia causes is Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Spread is by ticks, specifically the group of ticks that are called hard ticks, because there's like a whole group of ticks called hard ticks and a whole group of ticks called soft ticks. Examples of ticks that are in the hard tick group: the American dog tick, Rocky Mountain wood tick, there's a brown dog tick, a cayenne tick. There's lots of different ticks. You don't need to know the different names of ticks. But there's lots of different types of hard tick species that can carry this particular bacteria. If you get bitten by a tick that has this particular bacteria in it, usually within a couple days you start to get a fever and a headache. Sometimes that's enough to send you into the doctor's office. Then it's usually a few days after that you start to get a rash that starts in your appendages. So your hands and your feet, you start to get a rash, and then over time, over the next few days, it will start to spread throughout your entire body. But your extremities always start first with the rash. Now, I can flip back and forth between this slide and the next one. But this particular bacteria, again, it's in the rickettsia group. They are obligate intracellular parasites, but the cells that this particular bacteria target are the epithelial cells that line our blood vessels. So this is looking at capillaries, so all of those little blood vessel lumens. And that darker staining pink, this is the actual bacteria that's invading and taking over the epithelial cells that line our blood vessels. As it gets into those blood vessel wall linings, it's killing the cell, which is partly why we start to get this rash. This is almost like little burst blood vessels that's making these little red spots. And it's those capillaries that we've got very close to the surface of our hands on the surface of our skin on our hands and feet is where we start to see those bursting blood vessels. Now, if left untreated, it can be very deadly. The sooner you can get antibiotics, the better. It is treatable. We do have lots of antibiotics that can kill the bacteria. However, if you don't go in soon enough, it can cause enough damage to the blood vessel walls. Now, based on my map, it is called the Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever, but are the highest numbers of cases in the Rocky Mountains? No, but partly the Rocky Mountain dog tick is one of the carriers. So the Rocky Mountains are over here, and although that's found around there, it's not where the highest numbers are. Do we have cases here in Wisconsin? Yes, sometimes a lot of that is people that have traveled. We don't have a lot of cases here. It was, I know I wrote down a date somewhere. In the, yeah, but we have 8 specifically, and we're in that group. In 2018, La Crosse County had our first case. There was a female that was camping down on the south side in the La Crosse County. She had been bitten by a tick, didn't go to the doctor for a while, too long. By the time she finally got to the doctor, by the time they diagnosed, and again, La Crosse County had never actually had a case until 2018, she was diagnosed, hospitalized, and eventually died of it. So it is around here. Like, it was our first case, and it was like, oh, it's like, well, we don't really have cases around here. And then 2018, yes, bitten by a tick, camping, hiking, all that stuff. It is around. It's just not very frequent. It's more likely you'll experience patients that have traveled that have then picked it up. 2 other tick, they're again still in the Rickettsia group, also spread by ticks, is Ehrlichia and Anaplasma. I talk about them together because they both behave the same. So they're emerging diseases, which means we are seeing more and more cases of them every year. The one Ehrlichia that causes issues is Ehrlichia schafiensis, which just causes human monocytic ehrlichiosis. It affects monocytes. So it's destroying monocytes. Again, they still are obligate intracellular parasite. They're still in the Rickettsia group, even though they don't have a Rickettsia genus name. And then Anaplasma phagocytophilum. And I like to break apart words, because this is a really big word, but it's not a scary word. What does "phil" in the middle of a word mean? There you go. Like microaerophilic. Means it likes something. And a phagocyte, these are eating cells. So this is a bacteria that likes to be eaten by phagocytes. It just doesn't get broken down by them like it should. And in that, again, it's an obligate intracellular parasite. So ultimately, it's going to start to destroy our phagocytic cells. It is spread by ticks. That includes the deer tick. Do we have those around here? Yeah. So this is another thing to be concerned about. Based on my little picture, which of these 2 diseases, 2 bacteria do we have here? What is the... I was going to say, we've got both. Here in Wisconsin, we have both anaplasmosis or anaplasma and Ehrlichia in Wisconsin. Anaplasmosis is the second tick-borne disease in Wisconsin. What's number 1? Lyme's disease, which we'll talk about today too. So lots of ticks in our discussions of bacteria today. So it's one of those, I'm like, if someone's got a tick-borne disease in Wisconsin, if it's not Lyme's disease, it's most likely anaplasmosis. Now, the bacteria here was some other pictures just showing it, breaking it down into Wisconsin by county. I don't think I could find another one on the DNR website past 2017. But it's around. So this is just showing the number of cases per 100,000 that we do have cases here. The farther north you go at certain other counties, more cases. But it's here. This is not something that's not here. I'm like, it's here. We have cases. People are going in and getting diagnosed. Here was more of a 2017, I guess, to 2021. La Crosse County itself, not as many as the neighboring county. Anyone know what county this is? I remember correctly myself. I was going to say it was Monroe, but that's not Monroe County. This is Monroe County. That sounds right. Once you get into some of those areas, they have a lot of cases of both Lyme's disease and anaplasmosis. Again, this is particularly just the anaplasmosis. Again, the farther north you go, more cases, but it's still here. As you start to go kind of almost in the southern, eastern sides of the states, is it Jackson County? Oh yeah, that makes sense. There's less cases, but then you start getting into more cities versus people are out hiking in woods. You're going to see less cases. Now, again, I talk about these two bacteria together because they both behave the same. Both of them are attacking different white blood cells, whether monocytes or phagocytes. They get eaten by those white blood cells. They get inside of there, and instead of getting digested, they first make this little, what's known as a phagosome. It just means it's like its own little vesicle inside of a phagocyte, where it doesn't get broken down. It will start to reproduce. It somehow sends out some type of signal not to get broken down and digested, not to have some type of, I want to say I'm like, no, I'm going to forget the things, not to get broken down. And it eventually will then make it where eventually the white blood cell will be like, I know we're not supposed to break you down, lysosome, won't fuse. Eventually it was like, okay, well at some point it'll get broken down. It makes another protective vesicle called a morula. And it just, the whole goal for that bacteria is all bacteria are, get inside the cell, don't get broken down, start reproducing. And so it does this, and it starts to reproduce, and it produces lots and lots of bacterial cells. Again, they're all gram-negative, and they'll get released. They go find more cells, start all over again. It is treatable. Here we can actually see some of the bacteria and the morulas inside of the white blood cells. It is treatable. We do have lots of antibiotics that can treat it. How, some of the initial symptoms, are going to mimic Lyme's disease with a few differences. So you're usually going to have headache and fever, which a lot of times with Lyme's disease, you don't even get a fever. Chills, muscle pain, nausea, tired. But it's missing some of the more characteristic things that Lyme's disease has, because Lyme's disease affects a lot of the nervous system, as well as control of certain muscles. This generally doesn't do that. Like, you're going to feel tired and exhausted and chills and fever, you know your body's fighting something. It may have a minor rash. It's usually not as bad as Lyme's disease, and it doesn't form the bullseye's rash, although not every Lyme's disease forms a bullseye rash either. And so I'm like, right away, people will go in and think, I must have Lyme's disease based on the symptoms, and it's not. So they both have the same symptoms. They both behave the same. They're both targeting immune system type cells. Best prevention, since it's spread by ticks, is just don't get bitten by ticks. Making sure you've got the bug spray with the DEET in it, so protect yourself against mosquitoes, protect yourself against the ticks as well. Now, our second group, so we're on to our second of our fourth groups already, is the chlamydia group. Now, generally when you think of the chlamydias, everyone thinks of the STD chlamydia, but there are other bacteria in the group. The chlamydia group itself, again, they are very small. Kind of like the rickettsia. At one point, they almost thought they were viruses, but they're not. The bacteria in this group don't even have a cell wall. So whereas rickettsias, they have very thin cell wall. The chlamydias don't even have a cell wall. They're still gram-negative. They still have two membranes. They just don't have a cell wall, which means they can change shape a little bit. They also like to be parasites on host cells, specifically for the ATP. They can make their own ATP. They would just rather not. And so when they get ingested by white blood cells and different phagocytes, they literally steal the ATP from their host cells. So they're considered an energy parasite. Now, anything in the chlamydia group, not just genus alone, but the group, come in two forms. There's elementary bodies and reticulate bodies. I think I've got a different picture. I'm going to go back. The infective form. They're like the single, out in nature, it's the spreading form. If you're going to pick up a chlamydia bacteria, you're picking up one of these infective elementary forms. That single elementary body will then trigger endocytosis. It gets inside of a host cell, and again, it will do what it wants to do. It's not going to get broken down. It's figured out ways to avoid that, and it will start to reproduce. But it will form this little protective vesicle around itself, and when it's inside this protective vesicle reproducing, that's when we considered the bacteria as reticulate bodies. So elementary bodies, they're like off by themselves, infecting. Reticulate bodies, when they're putting all their energy into not infecting, but they're putting their energy into reproducing. At some point, these are going to burst out and then become elementary bodies and go infect other cells. That's their job. But we can start to see some of these actually inside of a cell. We can see elementary bodies, single all by themselves, and a reticulate body is this big, huge dividing structure. Lots of bacteria get released, causes lots of damage. Go back. This is again another smaller picture. That elementary body, reticulate body. Again, reticulate, they're not infective. Their job is just to put all their energy into dividing, but they're still protected until they get released. Now, the chlamydia that most people think of when they hear the word chlamydia is Chlamydia trachomatis. This is the sexually transmitted. It's not the only way it can be transmitted, but it is the most likely sexually transmitted bacteria. It can get into the body through any laceration, any kind of abrasion, any kind of damage. It can't just make its way past our skin. There has to be some type of damage for it to get in. It usually gets in and past some type of mucous membrane. But it can also get into the conjunctiva of the eyes, and it causes a lot of eye damage. So although it can cause sexually transmitted infections, it can also cause eye infections as well. Now, all the outward symptoms is because this is a bacteria that when it gets inside of the cells, it's an energy parasite. It causes damage to the cells, which will trigger cell death and inflammation, leading to all the outward symptoms depending on where you picked up the bacteria.
What's an example of eye infections?
I'll get to it. Again, there's like all these like random memes that I'm like, try to keep putting them in there. There's so many out there in chlamydia. Now, the diseases, again, depending on how you picked it up, it's either a sexually transmitted disease or an eye disease known as a trachoma. It just means it's an ocular disease. So most people are familiar with Chlamydia trachomatis as a sexually transmitted disease. What it can cause if it gets in, again, it's going to get in through some type of abrasion past the mucous membranes in the reproductive area and cause non-gonococcal urethritis. I like to break apart words. You're like, that's a lot to think of. Well, inflammation of the urethra, but it's non-gonococcal. This means it's not what? It's not gonorrhea, because that's the other big STD caused by bacteria. And actually, if you gram stain them, they're going to look pretty similar, because they're both going to be gram-negative. They're both going to be mostly cocci-shaped. This can vary a little bit in its shape. It's not perfect. But this is saying it's inflammation of the urethra, but it's not gonorrhea. It's not gonococcal urethritis. What would be the outward symptom of inflammation of the urethra? What do you think? That would probably send you to the doctor. Painful urination. And I'm like, if you have inflammation of the urethra, it's going to hurt when you urinate. That's probably what's going to send you, and you're like, oh my God, it hurts. That's usually the first thing that it will affect. But it can also get in, and as your immune system is trying to target it, it will cause inflammation of the lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes closest to the reproductive tract are right there in the groin. And it will cause very large, enlarged lymph nodes known as a lymphogranuloma venereum. Again, you have lots of bacteria all getting filtered out right there in the lymph nodes, right there. Also going to be painful. If it's a bad enough infection, it can cause inflammation of, I'm going to say the proctitis, kind of that whole area, and pelvic inflammatory disease as well. Depending on how bad, how long it goes undiagnosed, it can cause issues with sterility. kind of any STD can do that if left undiagnosed long enough. Now, if it gets into the eyes, now the main time that this gets into the eyes is during childbirth. Mom has this bacteria in the reproductive tract, and right at childbirth, infant picks it up. And this bacteria gets into the eyes. Again, it causes lots of inflammation of the eyes, lots of pus, but it's not a normal pink eye because it will actually cause the eyelid to start to turn inside out. And because of that, that turned inside out eyelid can start to permanently damage the cornea. And it can cause what's known as non-traumatic blindness, which just means you're blind, but not because of a traumatic event. It's not like you got a stick in the eye causing you to be blind. Non-traumatic blindness is that kind of non-stop damage to the cornea that can cause it. Any guess the prevention for it? To stop trachomas during childbirth?
Do they do the ointment for that as well as the gonorrhea?
They test mom for a lot of things right before childbirth. They're testing for various streps, they're testing for this, all things then treat mom before childbirth so that there's that decrease in transmitting lots of different things to the infants. Now, diagnosing it, we can get a sample, we can get any kind of, scraping, any kind of fluid sample near those areas. We can do antibody staining, which means the antibodies are labeled with a fluorescent dye, and if the bacteria is present, the antibody will actually stick to the bacteria underneath microscopes that have UV lights. We can actually see glowing bacteria. It can be kind of putsy. Our easiest way, PCR, molecular testing, looking for the DNA of this particular bacteria. Treatment, we do have antibiotics. Erythromycin seems to be the first one that's most effective, that's usually prescribed. And then if there's that damage with the trachoma, the ocular disease, you might have to have surgical correction on the eyelids. Prevention, abstinence, monogamy, condoms will all decrease the chance of that bacteria spreading. And even for the trachoma, testing mom. Now, I looked it up this morning because I'm always curious. How many cases of chlamydia do we have here in La Crosse County? So the 2023 numbers are not out. 2022 is the most recent. In 2022, we had 616 cases of chlamydia in La Crosse County. Any guess what the biggest age group was? I was going to say right around there. I was going to say 50% of them were in the 20 to 24 age group, and then 25% were in the 15 to 19. aka you're getting into the college years that are actually having the most number of cases. And they even then targeted down to locations, and the highest number of cases were people that were right here in like the college area of La Crosse County has the highest number of cases of chlamydia. I also looked it up because it was all in that same thing. Gonorrhea in 2022, we had 126 cases of gonorrhea. Randomly, gonorrhea has more cases on the north side of La Crosse than it does here on the college campus, even though they're both still STDs. And still the same highest numbers of age group. And then we haven't gotten to syphilis yet, but we had 16 cases of syphilis as well. So STDs are here. They're here. Now, although when you hear the word chlamydia, that is a group name, most people do think of the STD chlamydia, but it's not the only chlamydia out there. There's a chlamydia pneumoniae and a chlamydia psittaci. These are non-sexually transmitted chlamydias. They're still technically a chlamydia. They still have similar characteristics that all put them in that same group. Chlamydia pneumoniae causes about 10% of cases of pneumonia. So if you're like, oh my God, I have pneumonia and it was caused by chlamydia. It's not the same chlamydia that's an STD. It's in the same genus, but that doesn't mean anything. It just means, genetically it's similar and it behaves similar, but it's a completely different bacteria. Chlamydia pneumoniae causes about 10% of pneumonia cases, 5% of bronchitis, and about 5% of sinus infections. Again, it's a chlamydia, but it's not STD chlamydia. It's not like all strep are the same. Most likely for most people, malaise or tired and a chronic cough, kind of mild symptoms. Like nothing too bad. You know, it's kind of annoying, but it's usually not even anything that sends you into the doctor or the hospital. Chlamydia psittaci is unique is that this is a bacteria primarily found in birds, and people that interact with birds are at high risk of picking up. And whether it's you're interacting with pigeons or you're in a building that has tons of pigeons everywhere, which puts you at a higher risk, or if you've got patients or if you yourself have a pet bird, it puts you at a higher risk of picking this up. So it's called an ornithosis disease. Anything ornith is birds. And so it's a disease picked up specifically from birds. So again, if you've got patients and they've got birds, it's flu-like symptoms. So if a patient comes in and you're like, I think I have the flu. Well, you didn't test positive for the flu because we've got quick tests. And you're like, oh, but you have a pet bird. It made this bacteria, which is actually better than having the actual flu because this is a bacteria and is treatable with antibiotics. So you can get picked up by handling different birds, contact with the birds, any of their pet material, which is why even just having birds, like a ton of birds in your particular building and around them a lot, puts you at a higher risk. The third group out of our 4 group today are the spirochetes. Again, we don't work with any of the spirochetes in our lab. There's really only 2 that are full-on spirochete groupings, and because of, there's not very many of them, and because of their nature, we're not going to work with them ever in our lab. So they do have a coiled helical shape to them, and they actually move in a corkscrew fashion, meaning they don't use flagella to move somewhere. They actually will just turn and twist like a corkscrew to move. The top 2 genera that cause disease in humans, Treponema and Borrelia. These are not the only ones out there. There are other spirochete bacteria that can cause disease, less likely. Again, we're talking about all the more common diseases that you might experience in your future careers. Now, if you've never heard of Treponema or Borrelia, you've probably heard of the diseases they can cause. So the first one, the Treponema, its full official name is Treponema pallidum pallidum. You're like, still never heard of it. Causes syphilis. This is the bacteria that causes syphilis. And as I just said, we had 16 cases in 2022 of syphilis in La Crosse County, so it's here. Now, it only causes syphilis in humans. It only causes issues in humans. Other animals can be carriers of this bacteria. Now, it is usually spread sexual transmission. And again, it has to get into some type of abrasion, some type of opening, usually through a mucous membrane. And it goes through stages, 3 of them, but actually there's kind of like a weird little in between these stages as well. And this is if left untreated. And again, we have antibiotics today, but back 100 years ago, they didn't have antibiotics that it would always progress through these different stages. The first stage, primary syphilis, it causes canker sores, which is probably what's going to send you in to get treated. Because you're going to have big open sores in your reproductive tract. Now, if you still didn't go in and get tested, the bacteria will eventually spread to your bloodstream. Once it gets into your bloodstream, it becomes a lot more severe. This is when you start to have fever, chills, body aches, but outwardly, widespread body rash. Those bacteria are all over your body. They're in your bloodstream. Like pretty much your entire immune system's under attack or is trying to get rid of these bacteria. Now, this can last for weeks, even if not a month or 2 months. But eventually, as long as you have an immune system that works, your immune system will get rid of the bacteria during secondary syphilis. So then there's almost like a little in-between known as a latency phase. which means you're fine. The bacteria's gone. Your immune system got rid of it. And you have no bacteria in your body, it's gone, you're feeling fine for years, if not decades. But unfortunately, later on, as your body starts to decline, the damage that this bacteria did as it was traveling all over your body, living in your blood and your bloodstream, all of the parts of the body that that bacteria affected now start to show itself again. And you go into what's known as tertiary syphilis. You start to have central nervous system issues. You start to have heart damage. And it's because the bacteria was causing damage to the heart. And right now, your bodies can stand a little bit of damage to your hearts without any long-lasting effect. But as you get older and your heart starts to decline, the damage that was done becomes a lot more evident. Again, you can stand a little bit of damage to your nervous system, but as your nervous system starts to decline, it starts to become more obvious. You can start to develop the damage to the nervous system that controls your skin. You get these rubbery lesions called gumas. They say they're painless. I don't know, they look real painful. Again, that's nervous system damage that controlled certain areas of just your skin. The problem is when you get to tertiary syphilis, there is no treatment. The damage was done like years, if not decades ago. There's no bacteria when you're in tertiary syphilis. You got rid of that decades ago. At that point, it's just everything supportive. Now, it is primarily spread sexual contact. It can get spread through shared needles, though. So kind of the endemic populations, prostitutes, illegal drug users, are the biggest groups of individuals that have syphilis. And we had 16 cases in 2022. I don't know their backgrounds. I don't know if they fall into this or not. But one of the biggest problems for females with this bacteria is this is one of the bacteria that can cross the placental barrier. So Listeria was one that could cross it, and it caused lots of stillbirths. When this crosses the placental barrier, it causes congenital syphilis. It causes, as the baby's developing, lots of outward malformations. Honestly, when I was trying to find pictures to put in the PowerPoint, if you Google congenital syphilis, the pictures were bad enough. I'm like, I can't put this in here without having like warnings. It's disturbing because it's like as the baby was developing, they have serious outward malformations in child development if they survive. Now, health workers can be at an increased risk if you're working with open wounds of patients and you're not wearing proper PPE. This bacteria can still get spread. That's why we have proper precautions, universal precautions in place. Now, the incidence of syphilis kind of depends on where you are. In the United States, I don't know what's going on in northern Alaska, but we do cases. I know we're not in the dark red here. We used to have a lot of cases. Again, we started treating once we started to get antibiotics. So we started treating, less people had it, less people spread it. The number of cases went down, and it's been holding kind of steady. I'm not sure what caused the big decline here. We still are seeing slight upticks in certain areas. It's not something we can say, oh, it's anti-vaxxers. We don't have a vaccine for it. Some of it is just what's going on in certain counties and certain areas. Diagnosing it, again, it's diagnosed always in either the primary or the secondary phase. So one they can do, if it's in the primary phase, they can see those outward sores. They can do different types of antibody tests. If it's in the secondary phase where it's in the bloodstream, they do something known as a rapid plasmin regen. This bacteria will get into the plasma portion of the blood, which means we can spin the blood down, get rid of all those red blood cells that are in the way, and let's look to see what's in the plasma. They are a spirochete, so we can see these spirochete bacteria in the blood, indicating it's in secondary syphilis at this point. Tertiary syphilis. For diagnosing it, you can't do either. Well, you might be able to do antibody tests to know if you were at one point exposed. But tertiary syphilis, you can't look for the bacteria. This is, again, decades later. You don't have bacteria in your body anymore. And you might not even have antibodies anymore if it's been long enough. Tertiary syphilis to diagnose, they just have to look back at patient past history. Oh, I see when you were in your 20s. You weren't making great decisions back then, and I see that you had syphilis that went a really long time undiagnosed, which then leads to the tertiary syphilis. Treatment, penicillin is like the gold standard. That even those that are allergic to penicillin, they will still try to give low doses of penicillin with some other type of antibiotic, because it is the fastest working of the antibiotics against this bacteria. Otherwise, prevention, since it's primarily spread through sexual contact, abstinence, monogamy, condoms will all decrease the spreading. And then our second of our spirochete bacteria that causes issues is the Borrelia genus. Again, they are that spirochete. They're still gram-negative, everything in the PowerPoint is, but the top Borrelia that causes human disease is Borrelia burgdorferi, more commonly known to you guys as the disease Lyme's disease. So Lyme's disease is a bacteria spread specifically from the deer tick, which is in the Ixodes genus of ticks. Again, whether you realize that Lyme's disease was a bacteria or not, it's actually not a bad thing that it's bacteria, which means it's more treatable because we've got antibiotics. But understanding the tick life cycle can help kind of understand when you're more likely to pick up Lyme's disease. Again, we're right in the middle of it right now during the summer months. So when tick eggs, and again, I hate ticks all around, but when tick eggs are laid, they're uninfected, which is a good thing. At least we know like ticks don't just keep spreading it from parent to egg. That helps slow the spread. So eggs are uninfected. In the spring, they hatch into larvae, and as soon as they hatch, they're going to do what they want to do is they're going to try to feed. And they usually feed on small animals because they're very small, like microscopic. They're about the size of a grain of sand when they're larvae, so they'll usually feed on some small animal. And other animals besides deer carry this bacteria. So it's those larvae are going to pick up the bacteria in their first meals, usually spring and summer. Now, by a larva, it is potentially infectious depending on what it just fed on. But because the bacteria haven't had a long time in that larva to reproduce, they are less infectious. So if you're like, I just had a tick larva and do I have Lyme's disease? Less likely, because again, we don't know what it fed on. Maybe it didn't feed on something that was infective, and even if it did, the bacteria just hasn't had a lot of time yet to reproduce. But as the bacteria is in that larva all summer, that bacteria is just reproducing. So if you get bitten by a tick or a larva tick in the fall, it is more likely to pick up Lyme's disease than our larva in the spring. So the bacteria is in that tick, reproducing in that larva all summer, going into fall. In the winter, it does go dormant in those super cold, below freezing temperatures. And as it's being dormant, it is developing into its next stage. And note, the bacteria are still reproducing, but it's cold, it decreases. They're not reproducing fast inside that tick. As we start getting, as it develops over winter, it develops into a nymph, and so come that next spring, it is a little bit bigger, but it's also a lot more infectious because that bacteria was reproducing like all summer, all fall, all winter, and now we have a nymph that, come spring, super hungry. And it's usually during that spring, year 2, is that this is when we start to see bites of the ticks causing more Lyme's disease. Again, in the spring, these ticks have not fed all winter. They are hungry, they are voracious, and they then become more infectious because of how hungry they are. And so this is when we start, and everyone around here, they're like, oh my God, I can get outside, and you go start hiking. And this is when we see a lot of infections right away come spring. As it goes into the summer, it develops into a larger, still not microscopic, but still, this is larger adult, still super tiny, but it develops into that adult tick. And adult ticks can still live for several years, which is scary. That just means every year, as an adult, the bacteria is reproducing inside of it. Yay. So the spring months usually seem to be where we get lots of tick infections just because they're dormant either as they're developing from nymph to adult or just they've been dormant all winter as an adult. The longer the bacteria is in the tick, the more bacteria there are. It doesn't seem to cause any issues with the ticks though, so it doesn't seem to kill the ticks. It's just as they bite you, they are injecting that bacteria into you as well. Now, Lyme's disease signs and symptoms, I put on there a huge variety. Where's my list? You don't have to know all of them. Well, first, what are some of them that you know of? Yeah, the bullseye rash, but my little note on there, about 30% of people don't even get a bullseye rash. So, I mean, if you get a bullseye rash, it's like, yeah, it's Lyme's disease around here. But about 30% don't even get that, which then for a lot of people, then they don't go in and get diagnosed, which becomes an issue. Other than the bullseye rash, what would be other symptoms that you've known of? How many people have either had Lyme's disease or know people that have had Lyme's disease? Most people. It's around. What are other signs and symptoms that they've had?
I met a lady up by Green Bay. She was paralyzed for over a year, and they didn't know what was wrong with her, and then they figured it out, and
Why did it take them that long?
I don't know. And she's like, they figured it out, and now she was walking with a walker at that point. But she's like, I was paralyzed for a whole year.
That shouldn't have taken that long because it's Wisconsin and we've got Lyme's disease here. But it does affect muscle movement. I've heard of other people that they woke up and they're like, I just couldn't move my arm. Or I couldn't move my leg. Like I was almost having partial paralysis of certain body extremities. Because it does affect the nervous system, which then controls skeletal muscles. But other than those, which are pretty obvious, any other symptoms? Yep, and because that doesn't affect everyone either, and that's usually later, that it can cause almost like that droopy face. Yep. 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 And it's not super treatable. Yeah, and I'm like, for a lot of people, it's I'm tired, I have a fever, kind of just that lethargic malaise. It's overall, I'm like, your body's fighting something, which causes you to be tired. It can also cause you to have headaches. Again, partly that could go along with fever if you've got fever. It can cause night sweats, the stiff joints, sensitivity to light, irritable, ear ringing. You don't have to write all of these down. Can't concentrate. And you're like, that's all of me every day. This is unexplained, all of these. You can't be like unexplained, why you can't concentrate, but unexplained irritability. Again, your immune system's under attack. You've got a bacteria in your bloodstream. Now, localized is, you've been bitten by an infected deer tick. Again, most people do get a bullseye rash at the bite site. Problem is, if you've got long hair and you got ticks that got in your head, you might not see a bullseye rash underneath all your hair. And so even if you're in that 60% or 70% that get it, maybe you don't see it, or maybe you're not checking yourself. But this is usually one of the big clues that it's Lyme's disease is that bullseye rash. And then all of the other fever, fatigue, the generalized. If left untreated, which happens to a lot of people, again, not everyone gets the bullseye rash, and you're like, well, I'm tired, I'm fatigued, I kind of have a headache. You can explain all of that away. I don't know, I must be fighting something. I didn't get a great night's sleep. You kind of think of everything else except this because you're like, well, I don't remember a tick. I didn't see any bullseye rash. And a lot of people go undiagnosed for a long period of time, which then can lead to, this doesn't always, it can lead to what's known as early disseminated stage, where it then affects more severely neurologically, causing issues. This kind of gets into more of the can't concentrate. I was going to say, you can't concentrate, you can't sleep. It's affecting your nervous system, it's affecting your central nervous system. It can even cause heart issues. One of my coworker and friends, her husband was diagnosed with Lyme's disease at this stage, where at one point, they went in and these are all of his symptoms. He either has a brain tumor or he's got Lyme's disease. Well, which one, and why would you even say that? And so they did lots of tests, and they're just like, we live out on the country, I'm sure it's Lyme's disease. But still, for say, well, you might have a brain tumor, it was Lyme's disease, and it had progressed to the stage. He never had any bullseye rash that he ever saw. And it was, again, tired, fatigued, fever, everything he explained away, didn't go in and get tested. And what can happen is, even if you get diagnosed, because this could be months later before you might, a year later, it can eventually still cause long-lasting issues because it still causes damage to the nervous system. The nervous system, all your neurons are controlling your muscles. It can cause long-lasting arthritis. It can cause long-lasting neurological issues throughout the rest of your life. I was gonna say, I've got another coworker whose husband, I don't know why everyone's husbands seem to get it, still is suffering. Like went through into the early disseminated stage, neurological symptoms, still suffers, still has body aches and pains because it was left undiagnosed for so long. Now, Lyme's disease, numbers of cases are increasing. It's not because, again, we don't have a vaccine for it, but we are we're moving, as population grows, we're building out into the country. We're going out to where the deer are. You know, for us, we're like, oh, I love to have deer in my backyard, and I, plant apple trees, and I like to see them in the backyard. If you have deer in your backyard, you have deer ticks in your backyard. And in this part of the country, that's a lot of cases if you've got deer ticks in your backyard. You're just asking to have this in your backyard. Now, Lyme's disease is not everywhere in the United States. And so here, that's why I'm like, when you said Green Bay, I'm like, they should have known. And I'm like, here in the United States, in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and then over on the East Coast, because it all started in Pennsylvania, is where we have the highest number of cases. There were deer that were in Pennsylvania that had this tick, that had this bacteria in it, and we were populating a deer farm in Wisconsin with deer from Pennsylvania, which then brought the bacteria with it. I mean, eventually we'll all get here. But that's why these two particular areas have the highest number of cases in the United States. So in our area, super common. But if you went to, I don't know, Utah, Colorado, very few cases. They probably would have no one knows about Lyme's disease there. They got other issues, other things going on, but it's not something that they have to worry about. But here in our area, super common. Now, testing it, other than you can look at signs and symptoms, if you've got a patient that comes in with a bullseye rash and they're like, I'm tired, I'm fatigued, fever, some body aches, and I got a bullseye rash, they're going to diagnose in this part of the state. If you did that in one of these others, some of the doctors are like, oh, I've never seen Lyme's disease before. They're going to treat right away and diagnose based on signs and symptoms. But not everyone gets the bullseye rash, and having tired, fever, fatigue, that in itself is not going to do anything. So one of the tests they do, if you remember back to our immune system testing, is the Western blot test, where you have to show 5 out of the 10 markers to say that you truly actually have Lyme's disease. And here, we don't do the Western blot tests here, so if you do get tested for Lyme's disease, this is not something simple like a rapid strep test where you're going to have results back in 10, 15 minutes. They have to ship blood samples away to get the Western blot test, so then it usually takes a couple days before you actually get results. Treatment, antibiotics. We do have lots of antibiotics that can treat it. The earlier you can treat it, the less likely you're going to suffer from those long-lasting complications. Best prevention, avoid ticks. All the DEET, long clothing, light color clothing so you can see them. I think I've been a more updated. Nope, just kidding. 2015, I guess, was my most updated one I had on there. Again, we have cases here of Lyme's disease, farther northern states, and I know I've got a more updated one because Monroe County and Sparta and what's the camp? What's the military? What? Douglas. Is it Camp Douglas that's in Sparta? No. Fort McCoy. The forest area around there has some of the highest numbers of ticks that carry this, deer ticks that carry this bacteria. So if you're ever there hiking around for whatever, just note, Fort McCoy, a lot of cases right there. Our last group of bacteria is the Vibrio group. Now, Gram-stain, again, they're all gram-negative. They are a bacillus but they have a curve to it. So I always think they look like a V for Vibrio. So they kind of have a slight curve to it. They do have flagella, and they vibrate in the water. So these are generally tied, usually, to some type of water source. Not all of them. We'll talk about ones that are still Vibrio that are not strictly water sources. But a lot of Vibrios live in water sources. Some of them can even live in salt water, so in oceans. Some live in fresh water. Because of their flagella, they do kind of move and vibrate in the water, which also is what gave them their name for Vibrio, because they look like they're vibrating. And there are 3 Vibrios that cause disease. The first one, Vibrio cholerae, which causes the disease cholera. How you pick it up is ingesting contaminated food and water. And when I say contaminated, this means fecally contaminated, so it's a fecal-oral spread. And this bacteria, the Vibrio cholerae, produces a toxin, the cholera toxin. And on my next slide, I'll tell you how it works. But the cholera toxin causes massive amounts of fluid and electrolyte loss, which makes it extremely deadly. Now, I'll come back to the rice water stool in a second, because I'm going to go to the cholera toxin. So, little immune system, or a little A&P review. So here's your small intestine. There's those microvilli. You ingested some contaminated water. So the bacteria in there are that cholera is producing the cholera toxin. It will bind to cells of the small intestine. The cholera toxin does. Part of it breaks off. Part of that toxin breaks off, gets inside the cells that line our small intestine. So there's the cholera toxin. It activates an enzyme called the adenylate cyclase. I don't care that you know about it. But it activates another enzyme inside these cells, which causes the cells that line our small intestine to secrete out of the cells sodium and chloride ions. So that means the cells of our small intestine are secreting out of the cells chloride and sodium. This becomes an issue. So this cyclic AMP that gets made tells these cells to secrete chloride, sodium, and other electrolytes. This causes massive electrolyte loss because it's secreting it into the lumen of the intestine, which leaves with the diarrhea. Now, one of the things hopefully you remembered from A&P is that wherever electrolytes go, water follows. It's osmosis. And I'm like, so if the electrolytes are going somewhere, so is the water. And so this cholera toxin causes this massive electrolyte loss as well as massive water loss. Now, most of the time, if you have diarrhea, it's mostly water loss. You know, again, it's trying to get rid of bacteria, but if you looked in the toilet, it's going to be clear. But because of the massive electrolyte loss with the water, the diarrhea is a white, cloudy appearance to it. So they say it looks like rice water. And that's because you're losing all of this white cloudiness. That's all the sodium and the chloride and other electrolytes you're losing. Now, you're never going to look at rice the same when you got that extra water in your rice. But it causes this massive, again, this is what kills, is that patients can't replenish the fluids and electrolytes fast enough because it can causes you to lose a liter of fluid an hour. So you have to think of like a 2-liter bottle of pop, and you're losing that every 2 hours. That's a lot to try to put back into the body to match that. I mean, here in the United States, I literally don't have to go very far, and I could start to replenish water. But if you live in other parts of the world where this is more predominant, because it's fecal oral human, bad sewage treatment, if it would take you a mile to get fresh water, but you're losing a liter an hour, you're not going to make it. We don't have a lot of cholera here in the United States, mostly down in South America, Central America. It's about where I'm going this 2 weeks. That's probably there too. Drink fresh water. If you're ever traveling, but again, we don't have a lot of cases here, but if you have patients that have then traveled to these warm tropical climates in their winter vacations, and they come back, they could have drank water that was questionable and picked up this bacteria. Now, diagnosing it, the characteristic is that very specific rice water diarrhea. It's not like any other kind of diarrhea that's clear. Treatment, let the fluids and replace the fluids and electrolytes because the bacteria is leaving with them. We can try to give antibiotics, but unfortunately with that massive amount of fluid loss, if you took an antibiotic, it's going to leave as fast as it went in. I mean, we'd have to give very strong doses, hoping that some of it gets absorbed before it gets lost. Best prevention, proper sewage and water treatment so that you're not drinking contaminated water or eating anything. We do have an oral vaccine that can give short-term protection if you know you're going to go somewhere questionable and drink water. Second of our Vibrio doesn't get the Vibrio name is Campylobacter jejuni. It does affect the small intestine, the jejunum. It causes gastroenteritis. It is actually the most common cause of gastroenteritis. More common than Salmonella. More common. To grow it in the lab, it actually grows better at a little bit warmer than body temperature. And we do have very specialized media that can specifically target this. So we've got like all those different selective plates. We do have selective plates that can grow Campylobacter. There are lots of animal reservoirs, so we can pick it up. If your dog has it, your cat has it, it's fecal oral spread, means you're not washing hands. But poultry does seem to be the most popular animal this has. So people that have chickens, go to farms, are at a higher risk. Now, because this can get spread by interacting with chickens and the fecal matter, just like Salmonella can, both Salmonella and Campylobacter can both cause diarrhea. But it's a different kind of diarrhea. It's a worse diarrhea. Salmonella, I mean, you've got some pretty bad diarrhea, you've got some vomiting, you've got your basic food poisoning symptom for a couple days. Campylobacter is going to cause really bad diarrhea to the point it even turns into bloody diarrhea that can last for a week or more. Much more severe than Salmonella. Salmonella, you're going to feel like you're dying for a couple days, but then you're fine. This will probably send you into the hospital. Proper food handling, good hygiene. Wash your hands. Make sure food's cooked. And then our last bacteria, Helicobacter pylori. So it is a Vibrio, so it still has that shape with a curve, but the little note where it gets helical, which is helical shaped, is that it's like a Vibrio with a little twist at the end. So it's not just that little comma-shaped curve. It has like a little that with almost like it's trying to be a helical spirochete without it being. So it's slightly helical. It does have flagella, so it is motile. And this is a bacteria that seems to be found most likely causing issues in the stomach and the small intestines. Bacteria up is we're not washing our hands all the time. You're touching contaminated surfaces. So contaminated hands, well water. If you get your well water tested, this is one of the things they test for. And fomites, which are inanimate objects, so touching doorknobs and tables and anything else, is we can pick up this bacteria. Now, causes gastritis. This is inflammation of the stomach, and it can cause stomach ulcers as well as intestinal ulcers. It has a lot of virulence factors that allow it to survive in the stomach. Most bacteria cannot live in the stomach. It's super low pH. The acid kills most bacteria. These bacteria have figured out how to survive. It's not like they like the acid, but they can survive in that low acid environment. And it has proteins that inhibit the making of acid so that there's less acid that they have to survive. They have flagella that allows them to burrow through the stomach lining, causing issues. They have adhesion proteins that allow it to stick to the cells that line the stomach. And then they have enzymes that neutralize the acid that will then, almost secrete a high pH to cause that to be a neutral pH. So how the bacteria use those different virulence factors. So again, here's the bacteria. They're flagellated. They're moving. Why it has kind of a lighter color cloud around it is they're neutralizing the acid so that the acid is not destroying them. They're swimming that coats our stomach. Our own stomach acid could digest our own stomach, but luckily we're not digesting ourselves from the inside out because we do have a layer of mucus that protects our stomach from the stomach acid. So these will burrow through that layer of mucus, though you're going to use those adhesion proteins and stick to the cells that line our small intestine. As they burrow through that mucus, they thin it. And this becomes the issue. So they thin the mucus lining that protects our stomach. And if we don't have that mucus lining protecting the stomach anymore, the acid from our stomach will digest the cells that line that stomach. And this is what causes the ulcer, is that those bacteria thin the protective mucus, the acid wears away at that stomach lining. If left long enough, the acid will continue to wear away at it, that it then gets into the next layers of the stomach, and it gets into the area where you have blood vessels, and now you have bleeding ulcers. Now, it used to be thought, stress causes ulcers. It does not. Stress can cause you to produce additional acid, which can aggravate ulcers, but the ulcer had to begin there. Almost all ulcers out there are caused by this bacteria. Now, there are some drugs, some certain over-the-counter NSAIDs that can cause damage to that mucus lining as well, which is why you shouldn't take a lot of them. That can cause ulcers, but the majority of ulcers are all caused by this one bacteria. Testing for it, we're looking for an enzyme called urease that this bacteria makes. And although we can collect bacteria, we can do all this, the enzyme is so predominant that we can actually detect it in our breath. So there's actually a breath test that can test for this particular enzyme. Treatment, antimicrobial drugs, and then you're going to take antacids. Because again, you need to inhibit the acid in our stomach so that our stomach can heal and then replenish that mucus lining to protect it. Good hygiene, adequate sewage treatments so that you're not eating anything contaminated with this bacteria, proper food handling. It was a couple semesters ago that I had a student that I think right after this lecture, she's like, oh my God, I have like all these symptoms. This makes total sense. She went and got tested and had stomach ulcers. And then was on antibiotics after that. And she's like, thanks. And I'm like, you're welcome. So having ulcers is definitely something, it's super treatable. Get rid of this. Did I not record? No, I did. There we go.